I've never really considered myself a paranoid person. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. My parents have a decent-sized house for the city, and I've lived there my whole life. I'm 18 now, so I spend a lot of time alone, especially when my parents go out or travel for work. I'd never been scared of being home by myself until this happened. I'm not sure if it's completely changed me, but it's made me a lot more cautious, that's for sure. This was about 2 years ago. I was still in high school, it was late fall, and I was a senior. My parents had gone out to some event. I remember it was a Friday night, and I was looking forward to just chilling and watching TV. The house was pretty much as it always was. A little messy, with a few things scattered around, but nothing out of the ordinary. I made myself some dinner, ate in front of the TV, and everything felt totally normal. No weird vibes or anything. At some point after dinner, I noticed a couple of small things that seemed off. My phone charger wasn't exactly where I'd left it, and I could have sworn a book on the coffee table had been moved. It wasn't anything drastic, just little things that I thought maybe I'd forgotten I'd moved. I figured maybe I was just being careless or in a rush earlier in the day. Honestly, I barely thought twice about it. I went back to watching TV, switching between channels and trying to find something decent to watch. After about an hour or so, I started getting tired. It wasn't that late, maybe around 11 p.m., but I'd had a long day at school, so I decided to head upstairs and get ready for bed. On my way up, I passed through the hallway that leads to the living room. As I walked by, I noticed the curtains by the window were fluttering slightly, like there was a draft. That was odd. The window was cracked open just a tiny bit, maybe an inch or two. I definitely hadn't opened it, and it's not the kind of window that just opens on its own. I figured my parents had probably opened it earlier in the day and just forgot to close it properly. It was cold outside, so I went over and shut it tightly. The thought of someone opening it didn't even cross my mind at that point. After closing the window, I went upstairs, brushed my teeth, and got into bed. I was already feeling a little on edge from the whole window thing, but I tried to push it out of my mind. I put on some YouTube videos to help me relax, but I couldn't really focus on them. My brain kept replaying the moment I saw that open window. It was just a little crack, but still, why was it open? After about 20 minutes of lying in bed and scrolling through my phone, I started hearing faint noises. Nothing too distinct, just little creaks here and there. But they were definitely coming from downstairs. The house makes noises all the time, especially when it's cold, so I didn't think too much of it at first. But as I lay there, the noises seemed to get more frequent, like soft, almost rhythmic creaks, as if someone was walking slowly. I paused the video I was watching, sat up in bed, and listened. For a few seconds, everything was dead quiet. Then there was a sound, almost like a scuff, coming from downstairs. I felt my stomach drop. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. But then I heard it again, louder this time, a distinct footstep. I panicked, grabbed my phone, and quietly got out of bed. My heart was racing and my thoughts were all over the place. There was no way anyone was in the house. I'd locked the door after my parents left, and all the windows were shut except for that one I'd just closed. I tiptoed out of my room and onto the landing at the top of the stairs. From there I could see the living room below. Everything looked normal. The lights were off, and the house was dark, but nothing seemed out of place. I stood there for a minute, just listening. Silence. No footsteps, no scuffs, no creaks. I started to feel a little silly for freaking out. Maybe I was just imagining things. I turned around to head back to my room, but as soon as I did, I heard it again. This time, a much clearer sound, like the unmistakable shuffle of feet on the hardwood floor. I froze. This wasn't just the house settling. Someone was in my house. My mind started racing. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears and my hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run back to my room and lock the door, but then I realized my phone was downstairs on the couch. I'd left it charging when I came upstairs. I couldn't call anyone for help. I stood there, completely frozen, trying to figure out my next move. The thought of going downstairs to get my phone terrified me. What if whoever was down there saw me? What if they were watching me right now? I turned back to look down the stairs, and that's when I saw it. Just for a split second, I caught the faintest movement behind the curtains in the living room. It was like a shadow shifting, someone trying to hide. My heart jumped into my throat. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was definitely in the house. I backed up slowly, as quietly as I could, and headed for the bathroom down the hall. I didn't want to make any noise that would give away where I was. Once inside, I locked the door and sat on the floor, my back pressed against the cold tile wall. I didn't have my phone, but I could at least stay hidden in there. My mind was racing with all the horrible possibilities. Whoever was in the house could come upstairs at any moment. If they knew I was home, would they try to find me? I sat there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only about 10 minutes. I didn't hear anything else for a while, just the occasional creak of the house. I was hoping maybe whoever it was had left, but I didn't dare move. I couldn't bring myself to go check, and without my phone, I had no way to call the police. All I could do was sit there and wait. Eventually, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time coming up the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard but wasn't in a hurry. I held my breath, barely daring to move. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped right outside the bathroom door. I thought I was going to pass out. My whole body was tense, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The doorknob rattled slightly just for a second, and then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. I just waited, hoping and praying that they would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from the bathroom. I could hear them going back down the stairs, slow and deliberate, just like before. I waited a few more minutes, trying to gather the courage to do something, anything. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. Eventually, I heard the front door open and then close, quietly but distinctly. Whoever had been in the house had left. I stayed in the bathroom for a long time after that, maybe another hour, before I finally worked up the nerve to come out. When I finally opened the bathroom door and stepped out, the house was completely still. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the hallway and carefully made my way downstairs. The living room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it after my parents left. There was no sign of a break-in. No broken windows, no forced entry, just the unlocked door, and that brief glimpse of someone behind the curtains. I ran back upstairs, grabbed my phone, and immediately called the police. They arrived pretty quickly, but by the time they got there, whoever had been in the house was long gone. They didn't find any signs of forced entry or anything out of the ordinary. No fingerprints, no evidence. It was like the person had never even been there. But I knew what I'd seen and heard. The police told me it was probably someone who had been watching the house and knew my parents weren't home. They figured it was a burglar who got scared off when they realized I was there. That explanation made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep properly. Every little sound in the house made me jump. I kept the windows locked tight and double-checked the doors every night before bed. My parents were freaked out too, and they started setting the alarm system every time they left the house. Even though nothing was stolen and no one got hurt, the whole experience shook me. It's been a couple of years now, and I still think about it sometimes. I don't know who that person was or why they were in my house. Maybe it was just a random break-in, or maybe they'd been watching me for longer than I realized. I guess I'll never know. But ever since that night, I've never felt completely safe being home alone again. I moved into a new apartment in 2022, back when I was fresh out of college. I'd just gotten a job in Chicago. And even though I didn't have a lot of money, I was excited to get my first place by myself. The apartment was nothing special. 1 bedroom, a small living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. But it was mine. It was in an old building in Logan Square, not too far from where I worked. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was decent, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. At first, I was totally happy with the place. The move was stressful, like any move, but once I was settled, I quickly got into a routine. I'd get up, go to work, come home, make dinner, maybe watch some TV or read, then go to bed. It was quiet, which I liked. The building had a few other tenants, mostly older people, and I hardly ever ran into anyone. Honestly, it felt like I had the whole building to myself most of the time. I kept the door locked and didn't really think too much about safety. It's not like I had any reason to. I figured it was just a quiet neighborhood in an even quieter building. Nothing weird. One night, maybe a couple of months after I'd moved in, I was sitting on the couch reading before bed. It was late, maybe 11 or so, and I was just winding down after work. That's when I heard the doorknob rattle. It wasn't just a little jiggle either. Someone was twisting and turning it, like they were trying to get in. My first thought was that maybe it was one of my neighbors, someone who'd had too much to drink or who'd gotten confused about which apartment was theirs. I put my book down and waited for it to stop, expecting them to realize their mistake and go away. But the rattling kept going, for what felt like way too long. I stood up and walked toward the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. The noise continued, getting louder, more aggressive. I was suddenly very aware of the fact that my door didn't have a deadbolt, just a standard lock. I didn't want to say or do anything to provoke whoever was on the other side, so I just stood there for a moment, listening. After what must have been 2 or 3 minutes, the rattling finally stopped. My heart was pounding, but I didn't hear any footsteps walking away. I just stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to look through the peephole. I expected to see someone walking down the hall, maybe just a drunk neighbor or someone who'd gotten turned around. But when I looked, there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I stood there, staring out the peephole for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe someone had been knocking on a different door and I'd misunderstood. I know that sounds stupid, but at the time, I didn't want to admit how freaked out I was. I went back to the couch, trying to calm myself down. I turned the TV on for some background noise, thinking maybe I was just overreacting. About 10 minutes later, just when I was starting to relax, I heard it again. This time, the sound was even louder, the doorknob twisting and jiggling like someone was determined to get inside. I shot up from the couch, my stomach in knots. This wasn't just some mistake or a confused neighbor. Someone was deliberately trying to get into my apartment. I crept back to the door, my heart racing, and looked through the peephole again. This time, There was a man standing right outside my door, his face partially turned away, but I could tell he wasn't anyone I recognized. He was older, maybe in his 40s or 50s, with unkempt hair and wearing an old, worn-out coat. I could see his hand on the doorknob, still trying to turn it, like he was expecting it to open any second. I could hear his breathing through the thin door, slow and heavy, like he wasn't in any rush. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to make any noise or let him know I was standing just on the other side of the door. I was terrified that if I made a sound, he'd realize I was alone in the apartment and get more aggressive. I thought about calling the police. But my phone was sitting on the coffee table in the living room, and I didn't want to move from the door in case he tried something else. So I just stood there, hoping he would leave. The guy stood there for what felt like an eternity, still fidgeting with the doorknob, then suddenly stopped. I heard him muttering something under his breath, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. He wasn't speaking loudly enough for me to catch the words, but the tone was angry, frustrated. After another minute or so, he finally walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, then bolted over to the window and peeked outside. There was a streetlight just across from the building's entrance, and I could see the man standing outside, looking up at my window. I quickly ducked down, not wanting him to see me watching. I stayed crouched by the window, my heart racing until I finally heard him walk away. I didn't move for a long time after that, just stayed there, trying to process what had happened. I didn't sleep much that night. I locked the door as best I could and shoved a chair under the handle for extra security, though I wasn't sure it would do much if he came back. The whole thing freaked me out so much that I didn't even tell anyone about it for a while. I just wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. Maybe that was stupid, but at the time I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I kept thinking that maybe it was just some guy who'd gotten the wrong apartment, even though I knew deep down that wasn't the case. A couple of nights later, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. It was late again, probably around midnight, and the apartment was dead quiet. I was starting to doze off when I heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't the doorknob, it was the sound of someone trying to push the door open, like they were leaning against it or trying to force it. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Someone was outside my door trying to get in again. I didn't even hesitate this time. I grabbed my phone, went into the bathroom, and locked the door behind me. I sat on the floor shaking and called the police. I didn't want to confront whoever was out there, and I was too scared to go back to the door to see who it was. All I could do was sit there, waiting for the police to show up. When they finally arrived, they knocked on the door, and I let them in. They checked the hallway and the area outside, but by the time they got there, the guy was gone. There was no sign of him. They told me they'd keep an eye on the building and that I should call them if anything else happened. But they couldn't do much since there wasn't any real evidence of a break-in attempt. I felt so frustrated, but what could I do? There wasn't much to go on. For a while after that, nothing happened. I was still on edge all the time, constantly checking the door and jumping at every little noise. But I tried to convince myself that maybe it was over. Maybe whoever it was had given up or realized they had the wrong place. I even considered moving, but my lease still had several months on it, and I didn't have the money to break it. One night, maybe a month after the police came, I was coming home from work. It was dark, and as I was walking up to the building, I saw someone standing by the entrance. At first, I didn't think much of it. People stood outside all the time to smoke or wait for a ride. But as I got closer, I realized it was the same man. He was standing there, leaning against the wall, staring at the front door like he was waiting for someone. My stomach dropped. I didn't want him to see me, so I quickly ducked around the corner and waited. I watched him from a distance, trying to figure out what to do. After a few minutes, he left, walking down the street and disappearing into the night. I waited a bit longer, just to make sure he was really gone, before finally going inside. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept imagining him standing outside the building, waiting for me to come home. I felt trapped, like I couldn't escape this guy. It didn't help that I still didn't know who he was or why he was targeting me. I didn't have any enemies, and I hadn't noticed anyone following me. He was just there, always showing up when I least expected it. The next couple of weeks were quiet. I didn't see the guy again, and I started to relax a little, though I was still being extra cautious. I kept the door locked at all times, double-checked the windows, and made sure not to leave anything that could attract attention. But one night, just when I was starting to think maybe it was over, it happened again. I was lying in bed almost asleep when I heard a loud banging on the door. It wasn't like before. This time, it was loud, insistent, like someone was pounding on the door with their fist. I shot up in bed, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone. I didn't even bother to look through the peephole. I just called the police immediately. As I was on the phone with the dispatcher, the banging stopped. I stayed in bed, clutching the phone, waiting for the police to arrive. When they got there, they checked the hallway again, but the guy was already gone. I told them everything that had happened. The knocking, the attempts to get in, the man I'd seen outside the building. But there wasn't much they could do. They told me they'd increase patrols in the area, but without any real evidence, their hands were tied. After that, I couldn't take it anymore. I told my landlord I was moving out, broke my lease, and found a new place as quickly as I could. I didn't care about the money at that point, I just needed to get out of there. I never saw the guy again after that, but the whole experience left me paranoid and on edge for months. Even now, in my new apartment, I still get nervous every time I hear a noise outside or when someone knocks on my door. I've tried to rationalize it since then, telling myself that maybe it was just some random creep who was targeting the building, not me specifically. But there's always a part of me that wonders what would have happened if I hadn't been home those nights or if I'd opened the door. I don't know who that guy was or what he wanted, but I'm just glad I never found out. Back in 2019, when I was still living in Los Angeles, I had something happen to me that I've never really been able to shake off. I think about it all the time, especially when I'm alone in my apartment now, even though I've moved since then. I try not to let it get to me, but it's hard when something like this has happened to you. Back then, I had just started to build a little following on Instagram. I wasn't famous or anything, but I had a few thousand followers, mostly people who were into the same kind of fashion and makeup as me. I posted regularly, did a few collaborations, and started getting free products here and there. It was exciting, but I never thought of myself as an influencer or anything like that. It was just something fun to do on the side while I was in college. I'd get a lot of comments and messages from people, mostly other girls, but occasionally some guys would slide into my DMs. Most of the time, I'd ignore the weird messages, but there was one guy who started messaging me regularly. At first, it wasn't anything creepy. He would comment on my stories, react to my photos, and occasionally send a private message saying something like he loved my style or I looked great in that outfit. I thought it was harmless, just another random person who liked my content. But then his messages started to get more personal. He started asking questions about my life, like where I went to school and what I like to do in my free time. I didn't respond to him, but he kept messaging me, becoming more insistent. He'd say things like he'd love to get to know me better, or maybe we could meet up sometime. It made me uncomfortable, so I blocked him and didn't think much more about it. I figured that would be the end of it. For a while, nothing strange happened. I went back to my normal routine, going to classes, working part-time, and keeping up with my Instagram. I'd post regularly, share updates about my day, and interact with my followers. But then I started noticing little things around my apartment. Nothing major at first, just small things that seemed out of place. I'd come home from class, and a mug that I was sure I'd left on the kitchen counter would be in the sink, or my textbooks would be shifted around on my desk. I'm a pretty organized person, so I found it odd, but I didn't really think much of it. I just assumed I'd moved things around without realizing it. Then one night I came home late after spending the evening at a friend's place. My roommates were out of town for the weekend, so I had the apartment to myself. When I walked in, everything seemed normal at first. I dropped my bag on the couch, grabbed a snack from the kitchen, and went to my room to unwind. But when I walked in, something felt off. It took me a second to realize what it was. My closet door was open, just a crack. I never leave my closet door open. It's one of those little habits I've always had. I close it before I leave the room every single time. I figured maybe I'd been in a rush that morning and forgot to shut it. But when I looked inside, nothing seemed out of place. My clothes were all hanging where they should be, and nothing was missing. I brushed it off and closed the door, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. A few days later, I was sitting in my living room working on some school stuff when I heard a knock on the door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anyone, and my roommates weren't back yet. I went to check the peephole, but when I looked, no one was there. I thought maybe I'd imagined it or it was just some kids messing around, so I went back to what I was doing. But then I got a notification on my phone. It was a message from an Instagram account I didn't recognize. I opened it up, and my stomach dropped. The message said, "I like how you decorated your apartment." I sat there staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was reading. The account was private, and the profile picture was just a black circle. No name, no details, nothing to identify who it was. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. How would this person know what my apartment looked like? I immediately blocked the account, but the anxiety lingered. I tried to tell myself that maybe it was just someone guessing based on the little snippets of my apartment I'd posted on Instagram. But something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been in my apartment, that they'd seen it firsthand. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little noise, checking the locks on the doors and windows over and over. A few more days passed and things seemed to go back to normal. I didn't get any more strange messages and nothing in the apartment seemed out of place. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind, telling myself that I was overreacting. But then something happened that I still can't fully explain. One evening I was home alone again, sitting on the couch and watching TV. My roommates were still gone and it was getting late, so I decided to head to bed. I turned off the TV, went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and started walking toward my bedroom. That's when I noticed something on the floor near the front door, a crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, thinking maybe it had fallen out of my bag. But when I unfolded it, my heart nearly stopped. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "I'm watching you." I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. How did this note get in my apartment? I hadn't opened the door for anyone and the windows were all locked. I started to feel lightheaded, like I was going to pass out. I immediately called the police. They came pretty quickly and I showed them the note. They checked the apartment but didn't find any signs of forced entry. The windows were all secure, and the door was locked. They told me it was possible that someone had slipped the note under the door while I wasn't paying attention. But that didn't explain the message I'd gotten on Instagram, or the feeling that someone had been inside before. The police told me to be careful and keep an eye out for anything suspicious, but there wasn't much else they could do without more evidence. After they left, I felt even more unsettled. Whoever was doing this knew where I lived. They'd been inside my apartment, or at least close enough to see inside. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that someone had been watching me. Over the next few weeks, I became hyper-aware of everything. Every sound, every little movement outside my window made me jump. I stopped posting on Instagram altogether, worried that I was giving this person more ways to track me. I even considered moving out, but I couldn't afford it, and my lease still had several months left. So I stayed, constantly on edge, checking the locks every time I left the apartment and when I got home. Things quieted down after that. No more strange messages, no more notes. I started to relax a little, though I was still nervous whenever I was alone. I thought maybe whoever it was had lost interest or moved on. But then one night it all escalated. I'd just come home from a late class, and as soon as I walked in the door, I felt like something was wrong. The air in the apartment felt heavy, and there was an odd smell, like sweat and dirt. I stood in the entryway for a moment, trying to figure out what was off. Then I noticed the light in my bedroom was on. I knew for a fact I hadn't left it on when I'd left earlier. My heart started racing as I crept toward the bedroom, my hands shaking. When I reached the door, I saw that the bed had been disturbed, like someone had been sitting or lying on it. The pillows were messed up and the comforter was slightly pulled back. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Someone had been in my room, in my bed, while I was out. I ran out of the apartment and called the police again. When they arrived, they searched the place, but once again, there was no sign of forced entry. Nothing was missing, but the fact that someone had been inside was undeniable. I showed them the light in the bedroom and the messed-up bed, but there was nothing they could do without more evidence. They suggested that I change the locks and get a security system, which I did the very next day. After that, I didn't feel safe in my apartment at all. Even with the new locks and a security camera installed, I couldn't shake the fear that whoever had been inside would come back. I became paranoid about everything, double-checking the locks every time I left the apartment, watching the security footage obsessively, and avoiding being home alone as much as possible. A couple of weeks went by without any further incidents. I thought maybe the new security measures had scared the person off. But then, late one night, I got another message on Instagram. This time it was from a different account, but the message was just as chilling. It said, "I see you've made some changes." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things and stayed with a friend for the next few days while I figured out what to do. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. Whoever was watching me wasn't going to stop. And I didn't want to live in constant fear. I ended up breaking my lease and moving to a new place across town. It's been years since then, and I still think about what happened. I still wonder who that person was and what they wanted. I've changed all my social media settings to private, and I'm much more careful about what I share online. I don't post pictures of where I live or give any clues about my location, but the experience has left me with a lingering sense of unease. Even though I'm in a new apartment now, I still catch myself checking the locks multiple times a day, looking over my shoulder when I'm walking alone, and staying hyper-aware of my surroundings. I've never gotten any more strange messages since I moved. and I try to tell myself that whoever it was has forgotten about me. But there's always that nagging fear in the back of my mind that it could happen again. Maybe it was just some random stalker who found me online, or maybe it was someone who knew more about me than I realized. I guess I'll never know for sure. All I can do now is be more careful and hope that I never have to go through something like that again. About a year ago, something happened to me that I still have trouble thinking about without getting freaked out. It happened in my hometown of San Diego, where I was living with my family. I was 19 at the time and had just finished my first year of college, so I was back home for the summer. My parents had started going out more in the evenings, meeting up with friends or going to events, leaving me at home to babysit my little sister. It was never a big deal. I'd been babysitting her on and off for years. Most of the time, I'd just make us some dinner, let her watch a movie, and then put her to bed. That night was supposed to be like any other. My parents had gone to a concert downtown, and I was at home with my sister, who was about 8 at the time. I remember the day had been pretty normal. Hot, like most summer days in San Diego, and we'd spent the afternoon lounging around the house. By the time evening rolled around, I'd made her dinner, we'd watched a couple of movies, and then I'd sent her to bed around 9 p.m. After tucking her in, I went back downstairs, settled on the couch, and started watching TV. It was quiet, and nothing felt out of the ordinary at first. The house had this familiar stillness that I was used to whenever I was home alone, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing by outside. It was just a normal night. About an hour after my sister had gone to bed, my phone buzzed. It was a call from an unknown number. I usually don't answer calls from numbers I don't recognize, but for some reason, I picked it up without thinking. I remember just staring at the screen for a second before sliding my finger across to answer. The call was strange right from the start. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was a man, and his voice was low, kind of muffled. He didn't introduce himself or say anything normal. Just started asking weird questions. He asked if I was home alone, what I was doing, and even asked about my parents, like when they'd be back. I didn't answer his questions at first, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank or a wrong number. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. He asked if my little sister was asleep yet. I hung up immediately. The fact that he mentioned my sister, I hadn't said anything. Hadn't told him where I was or what I was doing. It was too specific, too creepy. My mind was racing, and I started to panic, thinking about how he could have known that I was babysitting her. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at my phone, half expecting him to call back. But nothing happened. The house was quiet again, and I tried to tell myself that maybe it really was just a prank. Maybe some random guy who somehow knew I had a sister and was just trying to scare me. I didn't want to freak out over what could have been nothing, so I tried to push it out of my mind and went back to watching TV. But I couldn't focus on the show anymore. I was too on edge, thinking about that call and the weird questions. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting it to ring again. After maybe 10 minutes, it did. Same unknown number. I stared at the screen for a second, my heart pounding before I finally decided to answer it again, thinking maybe I could figure out who it was this time. The second I answered, the same voice came on, calm and deliberate. This time he didn't ask questions. He just said, "You didn't answer my question before." That was all. I didn't say anything. I just hung up again, my hands shaking. Whoever this was, it wasn't a joke anymore. They were messing with me, and they knew way too much. I started pacing around the living room trying to think of what to do. I didn't want to wake up my sister and freak her out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the locks on the front and back doors, even though I knew I'd locked them earlier. Everything seemed secure, but it didn't help me feel any safer. Just as I was about to call my parents, my phone rang again. Same number. This time, I didn't answer. I let it ring, but even hearing the ringtone was enough to make my heart race. After it stopped, I stared at the phone, waiting to see if they'd call again. Sure enough, about a minute later, it rang again. At that point, I was panicking. I didn't want to stay in the living room anymore, so I grabbed my phone and went upstairs to my sister's room. I peeked in, and she was sound asleep, completely unaware of what was going on. I didn't want to wake her up, so I quietly backed out and went into my room, locking the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed, just staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. After a few minutes it did, but this time I let it go to voicemail. A few seconds after the ringing stopped, I got a notification for a new voicemail. My stomach dropped, but I couldn't bring myself to listen to it right away. I just stared at my phone, wondering what kind of message this guy could have left. Eventually, I forced myself to listen to it. It was short, just a few seconds long, but it was enough to make me feel sick. The same man's voice, this time whispering, "I'm already inside." That was all he said. I immediately looked around the room, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Was he really in the house? How could he be? I'd checked all the locks. No windows were open, and everything was secure. But hearing those words, I felt this sudden rush of panic. Like maybe I'd missed something. Like he really could be in the house. I bolted out of my room and ran to my sister's room, locking her door behind me. I didn't care if I woke her up at that point. I just needed to make sure she was safe. She was still sound asleep, and I didn't want to scare her, but I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for something to happen. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I told them about the calls, the weird questions, and the voicemail. They said they'd send someone over right away. As I waited for them to arrive, I sat on the floor by my sister's bed, trying to keep my breathing steady. I listened for any sound, any creak or movement that might mean someone was actually inside the house. But all I could hear was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the AC. It felt like forever. But eventually, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside, followed by a knock at the door. I didn't want to leave my sister's room, but I knew the police were here, so I ran downstairs and opened the door. 2 officers were standing there, and I quickly explained everything again, showing them my phone and the voicemail. They took it seriously, which was a relief, but they didn't find any sign that someone had broken in. They checked all the windows and doors, even the backyard, but everything was secure. No one had forced their way inside. Still, they stayed with me while I called my parents, and I told them what was going on. They were on their way home at that point, so the police stayed until they arrived. By the time my parents got back, the police hadn't found anything suspicious, but they suggested we change the locks and maybe get a security system just to be safe. My parents agreed, and they were just as freaked out as I was. The officers left after making sure everything was okay, and I spent the rest of the night in my parents' room, unable to sleep. The next day, my parents had the locks changed, and we installed a security system with cameras. We never found out who was making the calls or how they knew so much about our house and my sister. I didn't get any more calls after that night, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us. For weeks afterward, I was on edge every time I was home alone. Even though we had the security system, I couldn't stop thinking about that voicemail and the idea that someone might have been inside the house without us knowing. I never told my sister about what happened. She was too young and I didn't want to scare her. But I was constantly paranoid that whoever it was might come back. It's been a year now, and I've moved out to live on campus. But every time I go back to visit my parents, I still get that anxious feeling. I always double-check the locks and make sure the security system is on. I don't know if the guy who called me that night was just trying to mess with me or if he really had been in the house. But either way, it was the most terrifying experience of my life. This happened a couple of years ago. At the time, I was living in a small house in Tacoma, Washington, just a couple of blocks away from where I grew up. I had lived there for about a year, renting the place from a friend of a friend who was overseas for work. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was perfect for me. The house was a little old with creaky floors and an attic that I never really went into, but it had a good amount of space, and the rent was cheap. The neighborhood was quiet too. Mostly families and a few older people who'd lived there for decades. One of those older people was my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She was in her late 70s, maybe early 80s, and lived alone. I didn't know her all that well, but we'd talk every now and then when we saw each other outside. She was nice, your typical sweet elderly lady. She'd lived in that house for as long as I could remember, and growing up I used to see her outside working in her garden all the time. Lately, though, she'd been keeping more to herself. I assumed it was because of her age, but still, I made an effort to check in on her whenever I could. One afternoon, I was out in my front yard when she came over, looking a little more distressed than usual. She told me that something felt off in her house, like there was someone there even though she was supposed to be alone. I remember standing there, not really knowing what to say. She didn't seem scared, just kind of unsettled, and asked me if I could come over and check things out. I agreed, more to put her mind at ease than anything else. I figured maybe she had heard some noises or maybe forgotten about something in the house that was making her anxious. When I got to her place, everything seemed normal. It was just as I remembered it from the few times I'd been inside, cluttered with old furniture and a ton of little knickknacks she'd collected over the years. She led me through the house, showing me the different rooms and pointing out anything that felt wrong to her. But nothing really stood out. The windows were closed, the doors were locked, and there was no sign that anyone else had been inside. I checked the closets and even peeked into the attic, but there was nothing there. I could tell she was still uneasy, but I didn't see anything that would have explained why she was so convinced something was off. After I finished looking around, I assured her that everything was fine, and she seemed to calm down a little. I went back to my house thinking that would be the end of it. I didn't give it much thought after that. Just chalked it up to her being lonely or maybe hearing the usual creaks and groans that come with an old house. But the next day I noticed something strange. I didn't see Mrs. Henderson outside, and her house looked completely still. Normally I'd at least see her in the yard or at the window, but there was no sign of her at all. At first I figured she was just taking it easy, maybe having a lazy day inside. But then another day went by and another, and still nothing. I tried knocking on her door a couple of times, but she didn't answer. I didn't want to push it. Maybe she wasn't feeling well, or maybe she was just busy with something. But after almost a week of not seeing her, I started to get worried. I decided to go back over and knock again, just to make sure she was okay. When she still didn't answer, I tried the door, thinking maybe she was inside and just couldn't hear me. It was locked, so I walked around the house looking through the windows. I couldn't see much from outside, just the usual furniture and a few plants in the window. Everything looked perfectly normal. That night, things got weird. I had gone to bed early, but I kept waking up to strange noises in my house. footsteps like someone walking up and down the stairs, and soft creaking sounds from the attic. It wasn't unusual for the house to make noises. It was old after all, but this felt different. The footsteps were too regular, like someone was deliberately walking back and forth. I got up a couple of times to check, but I didn't find anything out of place. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a result of me worrying about Mrs. Henderson, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Over the next few days, the noises continued. Every night I'd hear the same sounds. Footsteps on the stairs, creaking floorboards, and the occasional soft thud, like something falling in the attic. I tried to ignore it at first, but it was getting harder to convince myself it was nothing. One night, after hearing a particularly loud thud, I finally worked up the nerve to go up to the attic and check it out. The attic in my house wasn't really used for anything. It was just a dusty, unfinished space that I had barely set foot in since I moved in. When I got up there, I looked around with a flashlight, expecting to find maybe a loose board or something that had fallen, but the attic was completely empty. There was nothing that could have made the noise, and everything was exactly where I'd left it the last time I'd been up there. After that, I started getting more paranoid. The noises didn't stop, and I kept thinking about Mrs. Henderson, wondering why she hadn't been around. I even thought about calling the police or checking in with another neighbor, but I didn't want to overreact. I figured maybe she had gone to stay with family for a while, or maybe she just didn't want to be bothered. One afternoon, about a week after the noises started, I decided to go back over to Mrs. Henderson's house one last time. Something was gnawing at me, and I couldn't let it go. When I knocked, there was still no answer. The house was silent, just like before. This time I went around to the back, thinking maybe I could see something through one of the other windows. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the windows near the back door was slightly open, just enough for someone to slip through. I froze. That window had definitely been closed the last time I checked. My mind started racing, thinking about the noises I'd been hearing in my house, the footsteps, the creaking. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't help but wonder if someone had been using that window to get into Mrs. Henderson's house. I thought about calling the police right then, but something stopped me. I don't know if it was curiosity or just wanting to know what was going on for myself, but I decided to go inside. I pushed the window open wider and climbed in. It felt wrong, like I was trespassing, but at the same time, I felt like I needed to know what was happening. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Everything looked just like it had the last time I'd been there. Nothing was out of place, and there were no signs of a struggle or anything unusual. I made my way through the rooms, checking each one, but there was still no sign of Mrs. Henderson. When I got to the attic door, I hesitated. I'd never been up there before, but something told me I needed to check. I pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up, my heart racing. The attic was dark and dusty, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. As I shined my flashlight around, I noticed something strange in the corner. There was a small crawl space, barely big enough for someone to fit through, but it was covered by a piece of wood that looked like it had been moved recently. I crouched down and pushed the wood aside, revealing the crawl space. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were a few blankets, some old clothes, and what looked like a small stash of food, like someone had been living there. My mind immediately went to Mrs. Henderson. Had she been hiding up here? Or was someone else using her attic without her knowing? I scrambled out of the attic and back down to the main floor, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I tell someone? I was in way over my head. and I didn't want to get involved in something I didn't understand. But as I stood there, trying to figure out my next move, I realized something. I still hadn't seen any sign of Mrs. Henderson. I quickly left the house, locking the door behind me. I went back home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. The noises in my own house didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Someone had been living in Mrs. Henderson's attic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they might have been sneaking into my house too. I stayed up all night listening for the noises, but for the first time in days, everything was quiet. The next morning, I finally decided to call the police. I told them everything: the noises, Mrs. Henderson's disappearance, and what I'd found in her attic. They came over and checked both houses, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. They told me that Mrs. Henderson had apparently left town to stay with her niece a few weeks ago, but no one had heard from her since. They said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't think much of my story. After that, the noises stopped. I never heard the footsteps or the creaking again, and I never saw Mrs. Henderson again either. The house next door stayed empty for months, and eventually it was sold to a new family. I moved out of my place not long after that, but I still think about what happened. I never got any answers, and part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I know something wasn't right. In 2021, I moved into a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. It was my first place on my own, and I was excited to finally have some independence after years of living with roommates. The apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people mostly kept to themselves. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom unit in an older building, but it had character, and I liked that it was tucked away on a side street where there wasn't much traffic. When I first moved in, everything seemed great. The place was small but cozy, and I spent the first couple of weeks settling in, unpacking boxes and decorating. It was just starting to feel like home. I didn't have many neighbors, and I barely saw the few that lived around me. There was an older couple in the unit across the hall who I'd run into occasionally, but we only exchanged small talk in passing. Overall, it was pretty quiet, which I liked. About a month into living there, though, I started noticing little things that made me feel uneasy. At first, it was minor, just random items in my apartment that seemed to be in slightly different places than where I'd left them. Nothing big, just things like my keys being on the kitchen counter when I was sure I'd left them by the front door, or a book on the coffee table that I hadn't been reading. I brushed it off as me being forgetful. I'd just moved in, after all, and I figured I wasn't used to where I was putting things yet. Then I started finding things in stranger places. One morning I found a spoon in the bathroom sink. I didn't remember ever bringing it in there, and it didn't make any sense for it to be there. Another time, I found my shoes, ones I hadn't worn in days, set neatly by the front door, even though I usually kept them in the bedroom closet. Again, I tried to convince myself I was just misremembering things. I told myself I'd been busy with work and maybe just distracted. It was the only explanation that made sense at the time. The first real red flag happened about 2 months in. I was taking out the trash one evening and noticed something weird in the dumpster. There, sitting on top of a pile of trash, was one of my coffee mugs. It was unmistakable. Same color, same design, one of a set that I'd bought when I first moved in. I was confused as to how it had ended up out there. I hadn't thrown it away, and I was sure I hadn't taken it outside for any reason. I figured maybe I'd somehow dropped it in with the trash without realizing it, though that didn't seem likely. Still, I didn't think too much of it. I just grabbed it, washed it, and put it back in the kitchen. But after that, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I became more aware of how often things seemed out of place. It wasn't just a cup or a spoon here or there anymore. Sometimes it was my clothes, sometimes it was books, and once, my phone charger was missing for an entire day before I found it under my bed, somewhere I never would have put it. I tried to ignore it, but it started to feel like my apartment wasn't as private as I thought it was. I started second-guessing myself about everything. One evening, I came home from work late. I'd had a long day, and all I wanted to do was take a shower and go to bed. When I walked into the apartment, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it right away, but it was like the air in the place was heavier somehow. I walked into the bathroom and noticed that the shower curtain was drawn shut, which was weird because I always left it open. I hesitated for a second before pulling it back, half expecting to find something or someone behind it, but the tub was empty. Still, my heart was racing a bit, and I couldn't shake the unease that had been building over the past few weeks. As I was showering, I felt a cold draft, like air was coming in from somewhere. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to close a window, but when I got out and checked, all the windows were shut and locked. I even checked the front door to make sure it was secure, and it was. The draft was still there, though, faint but noticeable. I decided to let it go for the night, but I kept thinking about it as I went to bed. The next morning, I got up early to get ready for work. As I was brushing my teeth, I felt the draft again, this time stronger. I was determined to figure out where it was coming from, so I started checking around the apartment. That's when I noticed something strange in the bathroom. There was a small vent high up on the wall that I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was the kind of vent you might see in older buildings, but I hadn't noticed any air coming from it before. I decided to take a closer look, so I grabbed a chair and climbed up to inspect it. When I got close, I realized that the vent wasn't just an ordinary air vent. It wasn't connected to any ductwork, and there didn't seem to be any airflow coming through it. The screws holding it in place were loose, and the cover looked like it had been taken off recently. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the cover off entirely. What I saw behind it made my stomach drop. There was a small crawl space behind the wall, just big enough for someone to fit inside. It was dark and dusty, and I couldn't see much beyond the opening. But there, inside the crawl space, I could see a few things. Blankets, some empty food wrappers, and what looked like a small notebook. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Someone had been living in there. Someone had been in my apartment, watching me, moving my stuff around, and I had no idea how long they'd been doing it. I scrambled off the chair and immediately called the police. They came over pretty quickly, and I showed them the crawl space and explained what had been happening. They searched the apartment and the crawl space, but didn't find anyone. Whoever had been in there was gone, and they didn't leave much behind. The police told me that it looked like someone had been using the crawl space to hide out, probably entering and exiting through a larger maintenance access that led to the building's basement. They didn't find much evidence, but they assured me they'd look into it. After they left, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I didn't know how long someone had been living in the walls of my apartment, watching me go about my day-to-day life. All those times I thought I was misplacing things. It wasn't me. It was whoever had been hiding in that crawl space, moving things around and messing with me. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise in the apartment made me jump, and I kept imagining someone creeping through the walls, watching me from the darkness. I thought about staying with a friend or getting a hotel room, but I didn't want to leave the apartment unattended, just in case whoever it was decided to come back. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of everything around me. I checked the crawl space every morning and every night, but there were no signs that anyone had been back. Still, I couldn't shake the paranoia. I started leaving lights on when I wasn't home, hoping it would deter anyone from sneaking in. I even put up a few cheap security cameras around the apartment just in case. A week went by without any incidents, and I started to feel a little more at ease. Maybe whoever had been hiding in the crawl space had moved on. Maybe the police presence had scared them away. But deep down, I couldn't shake the fear that they might come back. Then, one evening, as I was taking out the trash, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dumpster, on top of a pile of garbage, was the same coffee mug I'd found there weeks ago. The one I'd washed and put back in my kitchen. Somehow, it had ended up outside again. I couldn't explain it. I hadn't thrown it away, and I hadn't taken it outside. The only explanation was that someone else had. That was the final straw for me. I called the landlord the next day and told them I was breaking my lease. I packed up my things and moved out within the week. I didn't care about the deposit or the hassle of finding a new place. I just needed to get out of there. I never found out who had been living in that crawl space or how long they'd been watching me. The police never followed up with any updates, and I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that someone had been there hiding in the walls, and I'd been completely unaware.